Hey folks, hello again from the Geedunk podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. We have got a very fun conversation. We're going to talk to somebody who knows a lot about an item that's very important to us and should be important to you. We have joined today by our guest, Phil Ittner, who is an American correspondent over in Ukraine. And thanks for joining us, Phil.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Anything to keep Ukraine in people's minds.
And Phil, maybe you could start by just telling us some of your background and how you ended up in Ukraine.
Well, I am a veteran broadcast journalist with about 30 years experience under my belt. I've worked for all the big networks, whether it's CNN or ABC, NBC. I spent a lot of time at CBS. Mm-hmm. I was posted. Well, I went to Moscow in the late 90s to basically cover the news there. Saw the tail end of the Yeltsin era, the rise of Putin. Then 9/11 happened, and of course everything got absorbed in American news by that event, rightfully so. And I spent the next, 20 years or so in and out of war zones, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. It's a long list. And I was when COVID hit, I kind of reassessed whether or not I wanted to spend the rest of my life bouncing in and out of tragedies and being surrounded by not just war, but conflict and human tragedy and all the rest of it. And like so many of us, I think, I reassessed and said, you know what, I really don't want to be doing this. And so I was in the midst of transitioning to another phase of my professional life and getting out of news. But I had been on the Maidan Square in 2014, Independence Square, when they ousted Viktor Yanukovych, the Moscow stooge that had been installed here as president. And while I was on Maidan, I had people repeatedly coming to me and saying, when the Russians come, and I think that's important, not if, but when the Russians come to regain control of Ukraine, please, 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 they begged me, don't forget about us. So as much as I had hoped I had seen my last war, having made that promise to those people on the square in 2014, I knew that I wouldn't be able to look myself in the mirror if I didn't come back and keep my promise. So I came back when the full-scale invasion happened, and I have been here ever since. We're now into our fourth year, past our three-year anniversary. So we're into our fourth year of fighting here, and I just think that this is an incredibly important story that is grossly underreported and misunderstood because of it. And I firmly think that this is maybe one of the most important conflicts I will have ever reported on. Let's hope that's, the alternative would be that some sort of, open conflict with China would happen. But as far as I'm concerned, the struggle against Moscow, and in particular Vladimir Putin's Moscow, is incredibly important and is a historic moment in time that needs to be documented. And also, in addition to that, the people of Ukraine deserve our support. And one of the best ways that I can think of to do that is to bring the skills and the experience and the knowledge that I have to bear in supporting them. I'm a 50-something-year-old man who is going to be no good out on the front line. I think I can do better here at our Kyiv-based studio, where we do a weekly interview show with folks who have unique perspective, important voices, tried to platform as many Ukrainian voices as I can, because I think they should speak for themselves. But also, in addition to that, people who have long-standing relations here or a depth of understanding. So we try to get all aspects, but that's kind of where you find me here in Kyiv, and my intention is to
I'm gonna
stick it
cut
out.
right to the chase here. So Ukraine, as it's covered in the American press, obviously 3 years ago, it was when the war began. It was sort of massively covered, and things happened. There was the decapitation strike against President Zelensky. There was the air assault into the airport outside Kyiv, and why should your average American still care about Ukraine?
Because this is the line in the sand. This is if we let Moscow do this, we're sending a number of different signals to the global structure of which we are a part. We cannot hide behind our oceans anymore. The world is vastly different. It is changed. It is smaller. Attacks come in a number of different ways that don't just rely on planes and tanks. There's information warfare.
Yep.
There's cyber warfare. There's all sorts of things that affect us directly. The Russians are in our body politic. I have, from my years of experience with a lot of public affairs guys in the military who then transitioned to working within law enforcement or intelligence, I am well aware from the information I'm getting that we are under attack in America from Moscow as a part of a larger global plan that they have, a strategic plan that they have. So we are not immune just because of our oceans. And in addition to that, it sets, it upends the rules-based order post-1945, because if you can annex territory by force of arms, then we're right back where we were, 19th century, 20th century, might makes right. If I have a bigger army and you are smaller and you are my neighbor and I can attack you and take your territory, and I do so without any repercussions, then we're just back into that repetitive, dominance, conquest, empire, all of that. And that's what the Russians want to do here. This is an imperial war. It is a colonial war. Ukraine is not Russia. It is a colony of Moscow and has been for quite some time, and has struggled to resist that colonization for quite some time. So if we ignore this, we are ignoring the rules-based order. We're ignoring the very real threat that a reinvigorated, aggressive Moscow poses to us in the homeland, and also it restores this concept of, again, as I say, might makes right, and we've been down that road before, and it's led to massive tragedy. So it has to be stopped here, and the Ukrainians are willing to fight that fight. They're not asking for troops. They're not asking for a third world war. They're asking to be able to defend their land, and I think we, as as a former colony of Great Britain ourselves, should have empathy with that. We should understand that. We have fought imperial wars before. We don't like it.
Sure.
We don't like empire, especially when we engage in it. But we have not tried to annex land in all of our wars that we have fought post-1945. I can't think of a single one where we fought it in order to gain territory, to annex and make, we didn't try to make Iraq the 51st state. We didn't try and make Afghanistan or Vietnam the 51st state. The Russians want to absorb this territory, deny the people of this land their sovereignty, their self-determination, and their identity. Again, colonization, and we should be resisting that. Again, we as Americans should understand that pretty profoundly.
I'm in complete agreement. A A question. I have so many questions. And Bobby, I promise I'm going to let you jump in
No,
here.
no, no.
But
I got tons too. So go ahead,
yeah,
knock some
but
out.
how do you how do you square U.S. involvement here with, and we'll get to Trump in a minute, but the Biden administration. So one thing I heard for the prior 3 years from folks I knew, folks I trusted who had been over there, was that Americans were not really trying to win the war, and we're sort of giving Ukraine enough aid to keep the Russians from taking Kyiv, and but we're not really all in. We're not really all giving them exactly what they need to, push the Russians out of their territory. And I think you hit on a couple really important points. One of which is, rules-based international order and Russians' imperial aspirations. I'd also argue that we have a moral high ground. There's a moral argument to allow people's self-determination and to fight. And so my question specifically is, do you think that U.S. The Biden administration sort of capped our involvement in Ukraine because they were worried about World War III, or was it in a way, as long as Russia was invading, we remained kind of in this moral driver's seat, so to speak? Did we? Why did we not? Why have we not given Ukraine, everything, aircraft carriers? Why have we not done that?
Well, I think there are a lot of different reasons. And having covered this region for a long time, I mean, I go back to 2014 where they implemented the Minsk agreements to try and put a freeze on the lines because everybody was terrified of the ramifications of this, because it is this area of Europe is where both the world wars sprang from a very similar issue of a post-imperial order in the triangle of Europe that is kind of an isthmus between the Baltic Sea in the north, the Adriatic Sea in the southwest, and the Black Sea in the southeast. That little triangle has been soaked in blood because empires have always clashed there. Primarily the Russian, but you've also had historically a couple of other empires like the Austro-Hungarian or, the Germans or, what have you. And then to the south, you have the Ottoman Turks. So there's a lot of blood that's been shed here, and there are a lot of ties that once you start pulling on those strings, just like in the First World War and the Second World War, that leads to a major conflict. And I think that people in the West were terrified of that, both the Europeans and the Americans. Now, during the full-scale invasion that happened, the Biden administration, you're right, was very reticent to dive in. So were the Europeans, but the Biden administration, let's stick with the Biden administration. I'm in a little bit of disagreement with some of my fellow Ukrainian-based Western journalists and my Ukrainian friends in that I don't think they were just trying to bleed Russia. I genuinely think they were afraid of a widening of the conflict or an escalation of the conflict. Now, in hindsight, maybe that wasn't the right approach. Sure. I think there was also some domestic American politics going on, because had the Biden administration made a misstep and there was a massive escalation, that would have provided political fodder for the Trump team to get reelected. Again, in hindsight, that didn't matter because he did get reelected regardless. Mm-hmm. But I think there was concerns about an overstep here. And so they were very reluctant of provoking Moscow into something that would be devastating not only for Europe, for the continent, for the people of Ukraine, but also for, again, kind of global security and safety and his chances for reelection. We all know how that story played out. So again, hindsight is 20/20. I am of the mind that they should have absolutely flooded this place with a lot more. Once the Rubicon was crossed of, say, providing them with Bradleys or providing them with Abrams or Leopard tanks from the Germans, pardon me, or, you know, whatever, take whatever whatever weapon system you want. Once the Rubicon was crossed, we should have flooded this place with those weapon systems, and we didn't. I think they were, sadly, I think the Biden administration was taking a lot of domestic politics into consideration, and potential blowback from, you know, there's still blowback from the spending, the price tag that is presumed to be here. And this was not communicated well. We're not sending money here. We're not sending pallets of you know, shrimp wrapped $100 bills. We're sending weapons. We're paying,
which are built in America,
arms industry, right? And then our arms industry sends over the weapons. So it's actually financially, there's an upside, and that wasn't conveyed very well. So it's been mismanaged throughout the full-scale invasion, and even going back 2014, I would argue, because I think it's the prospect and the risk here is terrifying. That is legitimate. But if you let a bully you, if you do not stand up to a bully, he will just keep doing it. So the message we are sending to Moscow is we don't have a spine. And so what are they going to do? What happens the next time they try and take another stretch of territory? Let's not even say a NATO country like one of the Baltic states, but let's say they march into the Republic of Georgia, which is on their southern border.
Yep.
Are we just going to go, well, we're afraid of your nukes, so have at it? What does that say to Moscow? What does that say to everybody who has aspirations to get nuclear weapons? Because it seems the only thing that terrifies the West enough to kind of emasculate them, to weaken their resolve, is this fear of nuclear weapons, which we should all be very concerned about.
I think you're right. I mean, even some of the talks now amongst erstwhile allies, even, you know, the Poles are talking about getting nukes, right? You know, it's you know, if you have as a goal of foreign policy stopping proliferation of nuclear arms, you know, this is not the way. But fascinating stuff, Bobby. I've been speaking too much.
This is. I mean, fascinating is not even the word. It's like watching us repeat history in high definition now, right? All of the same mistakes we made 100 years ago as a global society, I feel like we're repeating, right? And, you know, I'm trying to explain to friends of mine who don't really understand international politics and this, that, and the other. I'm like, we're not just doing the whole appeasement strategy that led into, you know, World War II, Chamberlain and that. The term alignment has been used, right? And what absolutely terrifies me is, from a macro sense, if we do allow this to happen, not just as the United States, not just as NATO, but as civilization, where, like you said, might makes right, what's to stop this from happening in other areas of the world, and Moscow being that central sponsor of those actions? You know, just like before World War I, we're seeing countries realign themselves with new alliances, you know, BRICS and this, that, and the other, all of these reactionary alliances. But now you have military force, like you just said. We saw this Russia go into Georgia, right? It's not like they haven't done that before. We saw them go into Crimea and everything. Like, we haven't seen that before. Moldova's right there for the taking, right? You know, it's not a coincidence that, you know, Norway and Sweden and Finland, all of them are now part of NATO because they want that guarantee of security. However, the United States, being basically the person that backs that full security, has abdicated its responsibility, right? So this is what I'd like to ask you, Philip. We're talking macro sense. Let's break it down to the actual micro everyday lives of the Ukrainians, right? What have you seen? I mean, with your unbelievable background in war correspondence, what have you seen on the ground? What have you seen with the citizens that Americans need to be aware of? And the reason I ask this is because, You know, when this whole invasion started, watching fathers drop their wives and kids off at the train station to leave, and they pick up their weapons and walk back to the front. I was like, these, first of all, those of us who've dealt with Ukrainians or seen Ukrainians in military, these are some hardcore people. They are not weak by any stretch. And I don't know if Putin forgot that, but to watch that, right, 3 years ago, and the fight is still going on, how is the citizenry of Ukraine dealing with that right now?
Well, it's a trauma. It's a serious trauma, and they're exhausted. But they remain resolved because they know what Moscow intends to do. They're not just going to annex this territory. They're going to, and I use this word with careful consideration and with forethought, they will commit a genocide here. They will destroy the language of these people. They will destroy the culture of these people, the identity of what it is to be Ukrainian. Ukrainians do not have a similar mindset to the Russians. They're firmly European, where Russia has kind of a schizophrenic idea about whether are we Western, are we Eastern. Their national emblem is the double-headed eagle for a reason. One head is West, one head is East. Additionally to that, their sense of empire will be renewed. Again, I spoke about our American relationship with empire and how uncomfortable we are, especially when we engage in it. The Russians don't have that. The Russians are taught from a very young age that we are an empire, and rightfully so. That we don't, Putin himself has said, as a kind of a campaign slogan in his faux election process, Russia has no borders. We can expand and expand and expand as far as we want because we represent a certain ideology, we represent a certain cultural identity. It finds common ground with white Christian nationalism in the United States, which is troublesome in and of itself. But Moscow, after being knocked back at the fall of the Soviet Union, and Putin openly saying that was the worst disaster of the 20th century, they want to reconquer their empire. They will destroy Ukraine's identity. Ukrainians do not have a choice. If they stop fighting, they will be destroyed. Okay, if Moscow stops fighting, it goes home. If Ukraine stops fighting, it stops being Ukraine. So there's that aspect to it. But there's also the aspect, if you know the history of the country, that they have been abused by Moscow time and time again. There was a forced famine that killed millions of people here. It was, despite the narrative from Moscow, I live here in Ukraine. I know people that have personal family stories of what the Holodomor, which was the famine, the starvation that Stalin implemented in the 20th century. This is, believe it or not, and this is something that I think needs to be understood more and more in the West and in America in particular, this is the third war of Ukrainian independence that has happened in the last 100 years. Every time Moscow gets knocked on its back, the Ukrainians have tried to break free because the dominion of Moscow is brutal and cruel. So in World War I, after the Bolshevik Revolution, after the fall of the Tsar and the Russian Empire, Moscow contracts. Kyiv declares independence. A couple of years later, Moscow, having regained its strength, comes back and seizes Ukraine. Second World War, same thing happens with a lot of controversy, obviously, because many Ukrainians, despising the Soviets in Moscow, sided with the only other guy in town, which was the Wehrmacht. So they have that stigma, unfortunately, but that was another war of independence where they declared their independence. The Germans actually even tried to revoke that. That's the second one. This is the third one, and what I hear repeatedly from Ukrainians is, this is the last one. This is it. We are not doing this again. From here on out, there will be a country called Ukraine. It will be sovereign. It will be democratic. We will be able to tell our own story and to forge our own future. And that is one of the major reasons, if not the primary reason, why they are fighting so intensely. They know what'll happen if they lose. Their children going countless generations into the future will be slaves to Moscow, and they refuse to do that again. So that's where I think a lot of this fortitude comes from.
Phil, what over the last 3+ years now, it's a two-parted question. What has been sort of the most uplifting thing for Ukrainian morale? And then what has been the most devastating thing for Ukrainian morale?
It's a good question.
The thing that keeps their morale up is one another. Their families, their loved ones, their children, their parents, their brothers and sisters that are on the line with them. That keeps them going. Ironically enough, as much as Ukrainians want this war to end, the ones you will hear arguing most for keeping up with resisting Moscow and fighting this war are those guys who are on the front line, because they've lost buddies, and it has to count for something. So they're the ones that want to keep fighting until they push Russians off of every inch of their soil, realistic or not. So that is certainly something that, gives them strength. The thing that I think hurts their morale most is the Western lack of resolve. The fact that the people who, nations that declared in 1994, there was an agreement in Budapest that the Ukrainians would give up their portion of the USSR's stockpile of nuclear weapons, and in return, the West would guarantee the sovereignty and the borders in, it was signed in 94, so those borders. And it wasn't worth the paper that it was written on, apparently. And so that has been deeply disheartening for Ukrainians. And I think that's one of the things that hurts morale most, is this kind of wishy-washiness, or the drip, drip, drip of supplies coming from the West, or even the fact that we are so susceptible to Moscow's information warfare that we have adopted some of the lies and the misinformation, disinformation that's been put out there. And the Ukrainians, like the whole Nazi narrative, or the whole, corruption narrative, not denying that either of those two things aren't here. They are, but they're not determinative. That's not why they're fighting. They're not fighting for Nazis, and they're not fighting for corruption. As a matter of fact, corruption is something they're trying to tackle concurrently with fighting a war. So they're upset about their Western partners letting them down with the Budapest Memorandum, but also with this kind of like serious lack of understanding. And then one last thing I will add to why they are fighting as hard, and what I wouldn't say it's a morale boost, but every time they dig a child out from the rubble of a building, it just infuriates them. It just, every child that dies here, every returned POW who tells stories of the most horrific abuse, the cruelty of what we hear about in the occupied territories, the massacres, the war crimes. I mean, for God's sakes, they hunt human beings, civilians, with first-person drones in the cities along the front line, notably Kherson. They hunt civilians in a human safari. Their neighbors are dying, their friends are dying, and again, it pisses them off, and they wonder why the West doesn't see this and get as equally angry, but it incenses them. And every single bomb that drops on a city here just does the absolute opposite of what I think Moscow is trying to do, which is to break their will. And it's a 180-degree difference. It just makes them so much more angry and determined to defeat and push off this aggression.
Philip, along those lines, can I ask this question? I think President Zelensky is one of the most fascinating figures we've had hit the international stage in my lifetime, based on where he started, what he was. I tell people in America, he was basically the John Stewart of Ukraine, and now he is being seen very Churchillian. But as well as being just like Churchill, Churchill was voted out right at the end of the war in World War II. So I know he's not everybody's cup of tea domestically there. I'm fully aware how we see him internationally, but domestically, obviously, there are things that change and there are complexities to the politics. Overall, though, how do the Ukrainian people view him today and what he's done?
Well, he got a major boost recently after that disaster in the Oval. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
You're right. There are people who don't like Zelensky. But there's also a thing here in Ukraine, and it makes me chuckle because it makes me love them even more. They'll fight amongst themselves like nobody's business. They will disagree with one another. They will fight. They will argue. But the second you attack one of their own, nope, no. So to have Donald Trump do that and J.D. Vance do that in the Oval, his approval rating went up. I think it was 17% or something like that. It might have even been more.
Wow.
Zelensky is an interesting character. You're absolutely right. He unified the country, certainly at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. He has come under criticism. There are people who really don't like him and didn't like him prior to the full-scale invasion, but because of the situation, they're going to stand with him. I know people in the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament. I've spoken to them on my show, and their point has been, we don't fight amongst ourselves until this is over. So he has generally the support of the people of Ukraine significantly. There are still people who are critical of him, and were there to be an election held tomorrow, which would be illegal under Ukrainian constitutional law, because we're in martial law currently, all of this is legal, that there aren't being elections held here. That's part of the Ukrainian constitution. But even if they were to be held tomorrow, he would have a good chance of getting reelected, a very good chance of getting reelected. There's one person on the political landscape that might give him trouble, and that is General Zaluzhny, who was the general in charge of Ukrainian armed forces during the initial invasion. He was replaced by Zelensky, which is one of the reasons why his approval rating took a couple hits, because Zaluzhny was widely beloved. If there were to be an election tomorrow, the only other opposition I can see that would have a chance would be Zaluzhny, and that would be awful for both the Trump administration and Moscow. Sad that I have to link those two together, but they both would not like to see Zaluzhny come in as the president, because he hates the Russians even more maybe than Zelensky does.
Right. Wow. And Philip, that leads my quick follow-up, Dan, real quick. How do the Ukrainians view America under the Trump administration? You kind of hinted at the connection between Russia and the United States. What are they saying? Because, we're looking at it here comfortable in the United States, and we're just like, what the actual hell is going on here? But how are they viewing it?
When he was elected, when he won the vote, when he won the election, they were desperate to be optimistic about him. They wanted him to, because they knew that he could be so ego-driven, and that if he were to clash with Putin on kind of an interpersonal level, that maybe his ego could be used to Ukraine's benefit. They were hopeful that they could find some way to ingratiate themselves to him. Again, I think that's where the mineral rights plan kind of came along.
Yeah.
They were hoping and hoping and hoping that Trump would be good for them. I did not have that optimism. But I bit my tongue and I waited. I think the worm has turned. I think they recognize that in some way, shape, or form, Trump is compromised by the Kremlin. They've seen this kind of thing before where politics are manipulated by Kremlin information warfare and controlling the information space. Zelensky himself having said that Trump lives in a Russia bubble. Without getting too much into it, unless you'd like to, I think it's worse than that. I think that our president is compromised by the Kremlin.
Really?
Even if it's, I do.
I mean, we talk about it over here, and it's the whispers in the background, Dan. I hear them all the time.
Right. Well, and this is what the Russians do. Again, Ukrainians have seen this in their own body politic or in the politics of the former Soviet Union. If you get their game plan, if you know their codex, you can see how they manipulate political institutions, political bodies, divide and conquer within countries. I mean, what is happening in America is almost exactly what has happened in a number of different countries where they tested this stuff out.
For
now, having said that,
it's the most successful information operation of all time, bar none.
Let me finish my thought, and then I'll circle back around to why I really do think that we have to take seriously the idea that Donald Trump is compromised. It could be as benign. Well, I say benign. It could be as small a thing as he's a fellow traveler. He believes in the same sort of worldview that Vladimir Putin does, that there are these great powers and the world gets chopped up amongst the great powers. And if you happen to be born in a country that borders one of these great powers, well, you're out of luck. You don't have sovereignty. You don't have independence. The world is to be chopped up by the people who have power, dominating over those who don't, and we'll all divvy it up. It could be as simple as he agrees with that, Donald Trump, with that worldview. I think it's worse than that. I do think that there has been a concerted effort by Moscow, by the intelligence services in Moscow, to manipulate him at the least and work with him at the worst. And I know that what those folks out there who dismiss this with the Russia, Russia, Russia mantra, which, by the way, is purposely meant to diminish the very real threat from Russian information warfare and information and Russian active measures that have been implemented against America. So this whole Russia, Russia, Russia thing diminishes that and belittles the very real threat, and it ticks me off. But also, you know, the various things he's done, the ties that he has to all sorts of different Russian oligarchs, to Russian money, to, to very, very suspicious meetings and ties and agreements. There's I point to, one of the things that I point to is the death of a guy by the name of Mikhail Lesin. Mikhail Lesin was Vladimir Putin's right-hand man when it came to information warfare. He was the creator of Russia Today, or RT now as it's called. I saw him in the 90s when I lived in Moscow. I saw the information warfare techniques that he perfected within Russia to get them on side with Vladimir Putin. He eventually became very wealthy and had a kind of a falling out with Putin, and he emigrated to the United States. He then, subsequently a whole bunch of very, very suspect things. He was not a very good guy. I'm not making a hero out of Mikhail Lesin, but he goes to D.C. At the end of 2015. He goes to D.C. and he admittedly is an alcoholic, so he's drinking heavily. But he is found dead in his Washington, D.C. hotel room literally hours before he is supposed to meet with U.S. law enforcement. It is thought to be he had a meeting planned with the FBI. What was he going to tell them? Because D.C. Metropolitan Police report, if you read it, he beat his own skull in, which is a hell of a feat. So highly
like Team America, where they give the guy the hammer. They're like, you might want to take your own life.
Yeah. It's highly suspicious. There's also an incident in St. Petersburg in the early part of 2016 where Putin, and I know people who were in the Moscow press corps, Putin gathers unscheduled. He draws the Western press together and he says, if you guys don't get back the message to your various capitals or to your various people, that if you don't stop NATO expansion and if you don't stop the anti-ballistic missile system that you're putting in Europe, I'm going to attack you. He says it openly. He openly says in the run-up to the U.S. elections in 2016, I'm going to attack you. Well, he's not going to attack with tanks or with aircraft because he knows that NATO will just slap him down. But what they do very well is this form of hybrid warfare where they don't have to fire a shot. They let us destroy ourselves from within. I'm deeply concerned about the ties between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. I'm not, the Mueller report, I remind everybody, the Mueller report was inconclusive because it was obstructed. It did not come out and say there are no ties, we shouldn't be worried about that. Quite the contrary. They said we should be worried. They indicted a number of different people, including a whole bunch of Russians. And the Mueller report says, we got to be concerned about this. We got to be worried about this. But because William Barr comes out and discounts it, now everybody points to it and says, well, look, you had this what they call the Russian conspiracy or the Russian hoax. It wasn't a Russian hoax. Russia is currently at war with us. It doesn't matter what we think. It matters what they think. And they think they're directly at war with us, and they are attacking, and they are acting accordingly. If you think you're at war with someone, what do? You attack them. We've been under attack for a very long time, and we have not properly explained it to our population. We don't have Russia experts within the press corps. We don't. The State Department has been absolutely decimated when it comes to people who are expert. You look at what's happening in the second term now with the Secretary of Defense, for no discernible reason that I can figure out, saying we're going to stop our offensive covert operations against Russia. What is that all about? So we got to wake up.
No, Philip, not only do I agree, to give our listeners some context, there have been 14 presidents in the United States from the end of World War II to right now. 14. Both political sides. And the thing is, the reason we won the Cold War, it didn't matter if they were Democrats or Republicans in the White House. The strategic overview of how we viewed the Soviet Union and now Russia was pretty standard, pretty clear. It was bipartisan, non-debatable. So whether it was Truman or Nixon or Bush or Bush II or Obama, we had a comprehensive, unified strategy that lasted over 80 years almost. And all of a sudden, January 20th, everything has changed. And I mean everything. And I can't find from my, I recently retired out of the military in 2023. I dealt with the Russian threat specifically many times. I rationally cannot come up with any other reason for this happening unless there is some type of compromising that has happened here. It doesn't make logical sense. Our whole defense posture and structure has been created to deal with that specific threat longer than any other threat the United States has had to deal with in its entire existence. And in less than 3 months, it's been completely undermined and gutted.
The other thing I've always thought about Trump and Russia is there's a little bit of like the dog that didn't bark, and what I mean by that is, let's say you're hypothetically some corrupt American businessman, reality TV star, and you know, get elected president, right? And your only goal is to enrich yourself and enrich your family and do all these things. Like, why Russia? You know, I mean, you could imagine if you were Donald Trump, but you were doing the same thing with the Chinese or the Japanese, or, you know, pick a nation in Europe, or the Brazilians or whomever, the Indians, you know, pick a country. But it's just always, it always kind of comes back to Russia with this guy. And, you know, we grew up as a kid. You're at the end of the Cold War. I remember the Berlin Wall falling and all that stuff. And our generation of military service, we were hunting bin Laden, right? And you kind of forgot about Russia. And it's just, they didn't forget about us. And their long-term investment in Donald Trump, from going back to, you know, the early 2000s when Putin comes on the scene, it's, where there's smoke, there's fire. And man, there's sure been a lot of smoke for a long time, you know.
We thought our system, when we won the Cold War, and I say won in quotation marks or parentheses, yep, because did we really? You know, or did they just go dormant for a while, lick their wounds, rebuild, and then come back? Because they see us as their primary. They see the Anglo-American alliance. They've got a real issue with Britain, and they have for centuries, over dominance of Europe. But they see the Anglo-American relationship, and they see that as their primary opponent on the global stage. We thought when the Iron Curtain came down, and you know, Yeltsin was brought into power, and Glasnost and Perestroika, we thought, well, naturally it'll be our system that goes east. Democracy, the rule of law, capitalism, these great systems that we have and we're so proud of, obviously that'll go east. What happened instead, I contend, is that their system of cruelty, corruption, despotism, oligarchy, kleptocracy, that bled west and had infected a number of different capitals. You go to London, you walk down Knightsbridge, and you're going to hear Russian as much as you're going to hear, you know, any other kind of international language that's being spoken. They own huge parts of London. They have the largest Russian Orthodox church for a long time, and I think still is in Paris. How many offices and apartment buildings in Trump Tower did individuals from the former Soviet Union, whether they were Kazakh or you know, Armenian, or, you know, take your pick, but the Soviet Union, how many apartments or offices did they buy in Trump Tower? We should reassess that period from the fall, you know, the collapse of the Soviet Union to now, and recognize that what we had a little honeymoon period in the 90s.
Yeah.
But, you know, the second Putin got in there, it was definitely his goal was to destabilize and to disrupt the West, to harm the West as much as possible, because he looks at everything in terms of a binary relationship. Somebody wins, somebody loses. That's not his mindset, and it's not the mindset of the ruling class in Russia. And so they implemented this program to eventually get themselves back together, but then ultimately try and regain their empire. The only way they knew they were going to do that is if they could disrupt and harm the West. And I contend that that's what they've been doing. But one last point on this is that I also think this goes back much, much further, that Russia's place on the global stage is as a disruptor. And the brutality of Russia has been something that we've dealt with for a very long time. At the end of every episode of my program, On the Edge, I put a quote from Abraham Lincoln written in 1855, before there was a NATO, before anything else. And he writes in this letter to his childhood friend who's a slave owner, and he says, you know, we started this country, I'll paraphrase it, we started this country thinking all men are created equal. We now think it applies to all men are equal except for Negroes, foreigners, Catholics, and he lists a whole bunch of people that the exception to the, all men are created equal. And he closes this part of the letter by saying, if the know-nothings, the MAGA of their day, or the Confederacy or the KKK, take your pick, they've always been with us. If the know-nothings ever get control of the government, I would rather to immigrate to Russia, where at least they don't pretend to love liberty and freedom. This is a long-term issue that has, Russia has been a disruptor when it comes to liberal democracy, to freedoms, to rights, for a very, very long time. Their empire has plagued us, and there's no nicer way to say that. They've just been a problem. And they need to make reforms. They know they need to make reforms, and they're fighting desperately not to, because the ruling class benefits from their system. So we need to recognize that this is a big, big problem.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end. But before we let you go, I got one more question. What can the average American citizen do to help our Ukrainian allies continue to win this war and to win a just peace with their security guaranteed?
First and foremost, this is a winnable war. This is 100% a winnable war. If we support the people of Ukraine, they can win this war. If the lines were to be frozen right now today, it would be tragic to those who are held in Russian occupation, about 20% of this country. But Ukraine has Odessa, and Ukraine has a sovereign government in Kyiv. If those two things are maintained, this will be a victory for Ukraine and a massive defeat for Russia, and Vladimir Putin will be in serious danger. And I contend that Russia doesn't even have the capacity to take those major cities, much less a city like, there's a town called Kramatorsk, which is like 700,000 people. They struggle to take towns of 60,000 people, built for 60,000 people. Yes, the Ukrainians turn them into killing fields like Stalingrad. They evacuate the people, but the size of the city is built for that kind of capacity, and they make it into a fortress. So they are not going to take Odessa. They are not going to take Kyiv, and as such, they cannot win, quote unquote, this war. Win is a very difficult word to use, but I'm going to use it. The Russians, on the other hand, I think they can be pushed back. I think they can be, harmed if we continue to support them. We need to let our elected officials know that we support Ukraine. If there's a large Ukrainian diaspora, there's a large, there are many, many organizations in the United States that support Ukraine. Find one that is holding a rally this weekend and go. Get on the streets, fly a Ukrainian flag off of your balcony. Be vocal about, I do support Ukraine. I think we should support Ukraine. Don't hide away from that argument, because we need to let our elected officials know that this is something important to us. We generally in America have this idea that what happens in foreign lands doesn't affect the electoral process. Make it be known you're going to decide who you cast your ballot for, if they abandon Ukraine or whether they support Ukraine. Be vocal. That's my most important message. But as far as like what you can do in terms of financial support, be very wary, because there are people out there playing games. I work with a group called the Ukrainian Children's Action Project that was founded by a pediatrician, Dr. Erwin Redliner. I can personally vouch for them. There's lots of, there's Action Ukraine. I know they do good work. But, you can find reliable sources if you would like to contribute financially. But the most important thing is to not let the Kremlin or, sadly, the Trump administration write the narrative of what's happening here. This war can be won. This war should be won. And we, if we do not lose our resolve, can make it happen. So stand up, show up, and just, let it be known that you don't want this country to fall to despotism. A free and fair Ukraine is good for everybody.
Incredible. Phil, thanks so much for your time. And
thank you. Wow.
That was really cool, man. I really appreciate what you're doing, and thank you.
Spread the word, please,
for bringing us up to speed.
Awesome. And please reach back out if there's something that happens that you think needs to be brought to the American public.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you don't think the traditional sources of media
Yeah,
are
we'd love to check in with you.
No, I don't. I think sadly, the Western press has done a very, very poor job here. They don't have offices and bureaus here anymore. After the attack in Israel. They all kind of moved over there because they already had infrastructure, so they didn't have to spend a dime. They could just go into their offices in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. This is an expensive endeavor to cover for a traditional media outlet because they have to pay insurance, they have to bring infrastructure, they have to pay people, all the rest of it, and they're just not doing the job. And so because of that, the word is not spreading. And if we don't spread the word, Moscow will, and Trump will, and the fellow travelers within the Trump administration will. Fox News will. So we have to take control of the narrative, and the best way to do that is to get out there, get vocal, post on even such a thing as simple as posting on social media. Just do not shy away from the fact that if you do support Ukraine, you make it be known.
Awesome.
And we need to spread the word. It shouldn't be down to podcasters like me, or it should be news organizations. But if it isn't going to be a news organization, then we'll pick up the mantle. All we ask is that you listen.
Excellent. Thanks again, Phil, for your time. Really appreciate it.
All right,
Great to talk with you.
Thank you, sir.
Anytime.